The Rebel Capitalist Show.
You've got this new book coming out, and I was just listening to a recent interview you did, and it really challenged a lot of my thinking, which I think is awesome. I can't stand the fact that whether you're on the right or the left, or you're a libertarian or a free market guy or a socialist or whatever, we tend to get into these echo chambers, especially with social media. And it just gets reinforced and reinforced till we get to the point where we don't listen to anything else. And I think it really limits our ability to use and exercise that muscle of critical thinking. So tell us about your new book. And I really want to dive into it, especially that thing that you're talking about with MMT, how we're not there yet, but you're calling it some sort of hybrid version, which is like FMC. So give us the details of the book.
Okay, so believe it or not, if this is wrong, I'm going to blame you because you were one of the core catalysts to it, George. Believe it or not. So how this all happened was we got shut down, and I spend most of my year on the road looking for projects as a large financier, resource projects around the world. And my first book was a result of me staying home after my open heart surgery. That was a success. Yeah. And the interview that you and I did, we have today a very good mutual friend of ours, but he actually called me, and that was Robert Kiyosaki. He saw you and I have our chat. I guess he got my number from you or someone, and he would just call me every day. He's really persistent, and obviously, a pattern to success for everyone wondering. And his quest for knowledge was incredible. And he would pick up things that I wrote 6-7 years ago, and he'd bring it up and want to talk about it. And
he's like that with everything, Marin. Everything, not just investing. Amazing. He's like that with everything.
Yeah, and he would call me on Sunday at 7 a.m. and I'm like, oh man, hello. And anyways, and he would push my thoughts, and I think what you're referring to is Wayne Gretzky. I like to go where the puck is going to be investment. As the largest independent resource financier in the world, I was telling the gold guys and the copper guys that green energy is going to be this huge place in 2015. So imagine like the pushback that I got. So I've always been this contrarian player, but I may be a couple of years early, but the scores have been massive. So through that, I was starting, getting into things like, okay, we're actually, not at MMT, and we'll get into that. And I start with these fundamental theses that I had. And Robert kept pushing me. He goes, you got to write a book here. And he goes, this sounds like, in your thesis, it's going to be the rise of America. And I go, that's exactly what it was. And I'll tell you how I know America's reached such a low. What a cool name, the rise of America. I went online and Googled it on GoDaddy, and I paid $1.99 for the URL. No one thought of it. That's how it tells you how it's so contrarian.
You got the riseofamerica.com?
Yeah.
Was it available?
$1.99. Yeah, it was totally available. Everything. .ca, .com, .org. I bought it all for like less than $10.
That actually says a lot, doesn't it?
It does. So that's like why I'm bringing it up. So, and to get into the book, look, I'm a major gold guy. I built copper mines, gold mines. I'm a major investor in this stuff. So for me to say, hey guys, time out, there's an alternative view. And when you and I talk about the positive swap lines and negative swap lines, political risk, how this all ties in and where China is, there's such a, what Trump really did that everyone kind of overlooked was he broke the 40-year engagement of cooperation that America had dealing with China. And he said, no more, we're competing. Biden's administration is continuing with the same strategy. It is one of competitive engagement. And what this means is how can America compete with China? And that's really what I lay in the books. I also explain what are going against America. So you bring up MMT. FMC that I called Fiscal Monetary Coordination. Right. You got Jerome Powell on the M side, the monetary, the fiscal side, Yellen, and she's been on both sides. Like, this is really interesting. Think about what's going on here. This is not new, George. This is exactly, FMC is not new. And it's not like a hybrid going into MMT. This is an old, and this is the exact playbook that the Fed did after World War II. And it's essentially what built America's expansion to the West. It's what funded the incredible infrastructure projects like the Hoover Dam and the infrastructure in California, the Pacific Northwest, pushing out the infrastructure all the way to the West. FMC, the Fed guy, the most powerful Fed chairman, no one talks about him, maybe because his name was Marion. It's kind of like the boy named Sue from Johnny Cash. When you have a name like that, I guess you grow up with a chip on your shoulder. This guy was like in power for over 30 years at the Fed. He had such a grip on the Fed, and nobody talks about this guy. I collect books. I've got this big library at home, and I'm like, I just love reading at the end of the night, every night for a few hours after the kids are in bed, the wife's in bed. And it's like my only time where I'm not swamped from business and just, it's my only peaceful time is at the end of the night. And I started formulating these ideas. And that's where the playbook right now is FMC. Everybody's talking about MMT, and we're not even there yet.
Right.
And everyone talks about these deflationary pressures. And I go, wait a second, guys. You have to look at the velocity of capital. And remember, my background's math, and I try to take these really abstract, esoteric calculus formulas that the bankers use and the industry uses, and try to really break it down such that I could talk to my daughter about it. And that's kind of the style of the book. And the book's been out since May 25th, and as of today, it did hit #1 in America for nonfiction, not just in business. It was #1 in business. It's #1 nonfiction book. So I've hit a chord in America. Thank you. And it's because of guys like you and Robert Kiyosaki and guys like John Malden who are supporting my idea. That is kind of contrarian to their natural inclination. Read the book, see my framework, and the conclusion, the forbidden chapter, the publisher. Now it's a big book. It's over 450 pages. This is not a quick Sunday read. It's a deep book. And I talk about, the macro framework. And then in the abstract, I really break down exact investments, like Canada's largest green energy company that I was the second largest shareholder, and the exact mathematics of how do you evaluate these things. So I made it such that when you're a best-selling author, you have a little bit more leverage on your second book with the publisher. So I dictated the terms on this one. The first book I didn't. So the first 280 pages are framework, macro. The next almost 200 pages is all about very detailed, how do you go about investing for the guys like you and I that like to invest heavy into investments. So that's kind of the framework of the book.
Let's get into some of the nitty gritty, because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the overall framework is the United States has the global reserve currency, and that's not going anywhere anytime soon because of a lot of dollar demand in the future, because there's so much dollar denominated debt outside of the United States. So because they have this, we'll call it exorbitant privilege that's probably not going anywhere anytime soon, they can go ahead and crank up the printing press. They can run these massive deficits that are monetized by the Fed, which is kind of this FMC, where it's a coordinated effort like we saw in World War II, which is going to allow them to invest in this Green New Deal, let's say. And then, so what you're doing is you're sitting back and saying, okay, well, whether I like it or I don't, that's irrelevant. How can I make money from this? How can I profit from where the puck is going? Because the political winds have changed significantly, and they're not going back. We're moving forward in Europe, in the United States, in Australia, in Canada, with kind of greenifying the grid and the entire system. So how can I position myself to take advantage of these things? Understanding from a macro from a macro view, they're going to be able to run. They ran $5 trillion deficit basically last year. This year, who knows what it's going to be, but it's going to be, they're going to have the ability to run increasingly larger deficits that they're going to funnel into this shift of how we see and how we use energy. Am I close there?
The beginning, correct. And one thing I kind of want to jump in and really emphasize is, you haven't seen anything yet on the printing presses that they're going to use.
Right.
And more importantly, when you compare America's debt, the number is big and bigger than the other nations. But relative to the value and the GDP and all these other metrics, it's not as high of a ratio as the EU or the Japanese or Canada, or you look at other nations, or China, for example.
Right.
So there is so much more room. Now, remember, the key of being a Wayne Gretzky, who I got to know in 2011, great mind, and his success, he would say that he wasn't the fastest guy. He wasn't the toughest guy. He wasn't the most skilled player. But he would say, I would always go where no one else was. And that's the key. So it wasn't about what you want, how the world should be in your views. It is what it is, and play the cards that you've been dealt. So knowing that we haven't seen anything yet on the amount of stimulus, Yellen's just come out and she's being very transparent, saying, we're like doing 2010 math. We need way more stimulus. We need way more. Guys, think about it. Is that inflationary, deflationary? Where's the world going? Velocity of capital. That's what you have to focus on for inflation. Number two, this wouldn't have worked 15 years ago. The engagement of competition with China, they had an advantage. That's just the fact 15 years ago. But today, George, this all comes down to cost of capital. And I've been writing about this for years. America's great revolution, industrial revolution that's going to happen. The IP is here. The technology is here. The low cost of power is here. 15 years ago, it wasn't there. Okay. China had the advantage there. They had the advantage of the Chinese government support to build the infrastructure. They had cheap power. We have robotics now. We have new IP, cheap power. And then the missing element was low cost of capital. In the bond market, which is way bigger than the stock market, the bond market, there's something called green bonds. It's the biggest pool of capital ever amassed. In 2013 to today, it's grown by over 26 times. That's 60% year over year growth. And it's craving places to go. But where will it go? To companies that are decreasing their carbon footprint. That's the E, the environmental ESG aspects. Green bonds are ESG focused, or what's called SRI, social responsible investment. So you have to reduce your carbon footprint. Number two, how is it improving the social aspect of society when it comes to stakeholder capital? And then the governance, companies are saying they have to be 40% or 50% female by 2030. Minorities in executive branches and by 10% by that stage. So these are all these rules. Now, that's super cheap cost of capital. So that's 2-3% interest. And in a negative interest rate world, that's a good return for these ESG funds. But here's the thing. If they don't meet those criteria, the cost of the capital for these companies is going to go 6, 7, 8, 9 points. And that's all their free cash flow. So where this is all going is there's going to be huge reinvestment. We saw from COVID that the supply chain issues, it really exposed the world for the dependence on China. That's changing. Biden's administration, you don't need to be left or right. You don't need to be religious or non-religious. It doesn't matter. On the dollar bill, it is what it is. And this is where it's going. And you could take your piece of the action. George, if I was me, let's say I'm 20 years old today or 25 years old, and you want to become a super wealthy person, start looking into this carbon credit world. And I get into the whole ending of the book. There's a fortune to be made in this, and it's good for the environment. It's good for business because it reduces the lower cost of capital. And 3, it increases the standard of living of everybody. And what's good for America is good for the world. And I explain all those facts in the book.